going down in the shelters was a completely different experience. The aura around the adults was completely different. Like during the drills, like you could feel people were just kind of going through the motions. When they changed it and they said, this is no longer a drill, we're preparing, well, this is the real thing. It's like this, I was hit with like this wave of like, I'm never going to see my grandparents again. I'm never going to see my cat again. Like everybody who's not down here with me tonight, I'm never going to see again. I remember getting down there and my dad was supposed to be in the same shelter with us and nobody seemed to know where he was. I was really distraught about that. And then I remember they took the extra measure of actually strapping us into the beds. I suppose that there was some thought that if there was a nuclear holocaust, the Earth's crust would be destabilized, or possibly that there would be an attack at the base in Great Falls, and that would create, ripple effects through the crust, and that would destabilize. So they strapped us into the bunk beds in preparation, and that messed with me.
Welcome to Blinded by the Light, a podcast exploring the stories of people who grew up in Church Universal and Triumphant. We're going to be covering a bunch of topics today, including what some of the experiences look like around the time of the bomb shelter. How does a person find their own identity after leaving a cult or religion? What coping mechanisms people have surrounding religious beliefs and restrictions forced on them? And how do people heal from PTSD experienced in childhood surrounding spirituality? And then we'll get into some other kind of nitty-gritty stuff in how the loyalty and kind of Trumpism has saturated the cut world, the Church Universal and Triumphant world today. And then also talking about how toxic positivity affects the belief system and attitudes. And today I'm joined by Justice, whose family was involved for many years, and she has some insights to share about her journey. Justice, can you talk a bit about your background in the church and how old you were when your family was involved?
I was actually born into the church, but we didn't live on church property at the time. We lived in Oklahoma City. So I think my parents had been members for a year, and they were both active members of the Oklahoma City study group chapter. And so that was 1980. And we lived there for a few more years. They moved around a bit from Oklahoma to Texas, back to Oklahoma again. But some of my earliest memories were actually really pretty sweet. Was going to Sunday school with some of the kids that were like surrogate family for me. We had a few families that I grew up with that they were like second family members. Like we were close in age. We did stuff together. I remember one of the dads like coming dressed up as Santa Claus for Christmas one year. And then I moved away and I lived with my grandparents in Oklahoma City, and I went to Catholic school, and I had, kind of more of a secular upbringing for a couple of years. And then in 1989, the summer of 1989, my parents decided to join staff. And that was a really big change.
Can you talk about what being a staff member in the church means?
So a staff member is somebody who lives on the property. For the most part, their room and board was provided by the church in exchange for some kind of labor. Special skills or kitchen labor, field labor, whatever it was. But you're an integrated member of the community and subject to all the community rules. Whereas when you're not living on staff, it seems like most people sort of lived a little bit looser than the church standards. Living on staff really meant that you were expected to perform and lived to a higher quality. So you were really expected to follow the rules. You were expected to act as an ambassador for other kids who were coming onto the property who weren't staff kids. And those are things that I remember like being ingrained pretty early, like within months of joining staff.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's important for people to know that distinction because there was kind of this diaspora of cut membership all over the United States, but people who are on staff had much more lifestyle restrictions. There was there were a lot more rules they had to abide by if they made that commitment. Yeah, my parents were also on staff starting in the late 80s, and then they didn't leave staff until the late 90s. And then my dad was even on there until like 2002 or 2003. So their tenure lasted a lot longer than some of the people who got out right after the bomb shelter episode cycle, whatever you want to call it. Different people call it different things. What was your experience around the time of the bomb shelters in 1990 and 1991?
So what I remember was we joined staff and they were in full on preparation mode already. So people were working overtime, either planting, harvesting, weeding, sorting, drying foods. And even as kids, we were expected to participate in community service, which I don't think is particularly a bad thing. I don't think it's damaging for kids to learn how to garden and that kind of stuff. Like it's the context, you know. It's like you're doing this because you're preparing food for the end of the world. Like it changes it from we're doing this as a sustainable community, which we were as well. But there was another element that was overlaid with it, and that everybody, to the degree that they were cognizant, also understood that this was in greater preparation for something catastrophic. Same thing with, I remember going to like the Army Navy store in Bozeman and like getting like, I remember those big green duffel bags and stuffing those with clothes that were way too big, you know, collecting clothes that were supposed to last us for like the 7 years that we would be underground and after, because we were all operating under the assumption that textile manufacturing, that everything that we had basically come to count on as a society would be non-functional anymore. So it was stockpiling of like sanitary supplies, toilet paper, like all of this stuff, as well as food and clothing, and all of that kind of came with this understanding of like there was this sort of urgency and like preparation. And it kind of went back and forth from being like a game to being like there's something serious going on here. And the line wasn't always clear, if that makes sense.
I agree. And especially as a child, you were a preteen. That's hard to process that the end of the world might be happening. How do you even comprehend that?
I don't know. They tried to prepare us by having us watch movies like Red Dawn, like every Saturday. And there's another one too, like these movies about like invasion and then war. And it was meant to mentally prepare us for what we were supposed to survive, which is kind of weird if you think about it. Like, like having kids, like mentally preparing kids that way. So what I remember was that we were doing drills, and the drills were kind of fun because it was understood that we weren't going to have school the next day, and we were all kind of like on this adventure with our friends, right? And they were doing the drills in the middle of the night, so they came down They loaded us all up on the buses, drove us up this windy, pretty much one lane dirt road into the heart of the mountains in the frigid cold. This was maybe February. I can't remember exactly. But I know it was wintertime. And then you get up there and like, from what I remember is like the opening, the entrance to the shelters was almost kind of like an airplane hangar. There was a lot of stuff going on. And then there was tracks that led down to the individual shelter openings. And they used like a railroad cart, like a hand cart that was hand operated, right? To take people to the individual openings and then down the ladder and into their shelter. And I don't remember being particularly disturbed the night that I knew it was a drill. So this is another one of those things where it changes, like the context of it changes from being a game to being something that's not fun anymore. Because after they said that there wasn't going to be another drill, they did it again. And they came for us in the middle of the night. And I remember being so distraught. I couldn't take my cat with me. She had just had kittens. I was really mad and upset about that. And I was very vocal always about how I felt. Going down in the shelters was a completely different experience. The aura around the adults was completely different. Like during the drills, like you could feel people were just kind of going through the motions. When they changed it and they said, this is no longer a drill, we're preparing, well, this is the real thing. It's like this, I was hit with like this wave of like, I'm never going to see my grandparents again. I'm never going to see my cat again. Like everybody who's not down here with me tonight, I'm never going to see again. I remember getting down there and my dad was supposed to be in the same shelter with us and nobody seemed to know where he was. I was really distraught about that. And then I remember they took the extra measure of actually strapping us into the beds. I suppose that there was some thought that if there was a nuclear holocaust, the Earth's crust would be destabilized, or possibly that there would be an attack at the base in Great Falls, and that would create, ripple effects through the crust, and that would destabilize. So they strapped us into the bunk beds in preparation. And that messed with me. That messed with me for years. I recently had sort of a PTSD episode come up specifically around that, around being able to viscerally still feel that. I had claustrophobia for years that I tracked to that night. Like it left a very deep impact. Absolutely.
The pods, the bomb shelters, were you in with a bunch of other families in a larger one, or describe what that was like? Was it just, how many people were in there?
I believe I was in number 5, if I remember correctly. And they had us split up. So I think it was me and like 2 other friends in a bed that were in the same age group as me. And then my brothers and like 2 boys the same age as them were in a different pod, basically, right? And because even then, I believe they had us sectioned up. They had us split up by sexes. So the girls and boys were in different bunkers that night. I know I wasn't strapped in with my brothers. I was strapped in with 2 female friends. And I don't think my mom was in there. My mom, I believe, was either helping people up and down the ladders, or was possibly in the chapel decreeing. I remember distinctly that she wasn't there. And I remember even more distinctly that I had no idea where my dad was. And nobody was really explaining to us what was going on.
Or when did you find out that the inner circle thought that the world was really going to end? Because I've heard from some people, including my own parents, that said, oh no, it was just a drill. It was just a drill. When did you find out that it wasn't just a drill the second time?
I believe that they made it clear putting us up on the buses that it wasn't a drill. I remember distinctly knowing the second time was not a drill as it was happening and unfolding. whether somebody said that to me, whether my mom said that to me, or whether it slipped out, or whether just instinctively I knew that they were making that it was different. It was different from the night before. I knew. I remember the first night we were sitting in the bunks and we were playing games and we were talking and we all understood that it felt like a kind of a weird slumber party, right? We knew we weren't going to have to go to school tomorrow. And the second time, we were strapped into bunk beds. There was no lights on. All the adults were in the chapel decreeing. Like, it was not the same thing at all.
It's funny you say that because even up until my mid-20s, I remember asking my parents, like, why did people give away their life savings? Why did they do all these things, all this preparation, stock ammunition, stock, years of food and all of this stuff, if it was more just a prep? And then why, if it was only a drill, were people behaving this way? And I didn't know. I believed until my mid-20s that it was just a drill. And so that's how I rationalized my parents, still being a part of it and still latching onto those beliefs. And it wasn't until reading Erin's book in 2014 and her actually talking about what was going on in the inner circle, like, yeah, the world's gonna end, and we're gonna walk outside when the fallout is to a point where it's safe to walk outside, and it's gonna be a different world. And not many people would have survived. So it was, it was really weird not knowing that and not knowing the experiences of people like yourself, and kind of having those stories pushed away, kind of in the shadows. And that was really a pivotal thing in kind of coming to grips with conflicting stories about what happened with the bomb shelters, and the different people that stayed in for years later rationalized it in different ways. What did your parents do after the world didn't end?
I mean, life kind of carried on in a similar fashion. I think what my mom has shared with me about her reasons for being there, not only in preparation for a potential Armageddon, but my mother knew that she wasn't entirely mentally stable. She knew that she needed help. She wanted community. She wanted to raise us in a more agriculturally kind of based, sort of away from the toxicity of what modern society was becoming. That was a big motivating factor for her. My father was one of Elizabeth Clare Prophet's doctors. They had a unique relationship where he was often on call for her needs. And as Erin talks about in her book, her health conditions were deteriorating for a long time. And my dad was kind of a weird sort of doctor, and he was treating her. So my parents weren't married by the time that they joined staff. It had been suggested by the Ascended Masters that they try to repair their relationship. Thank God they didn't. That would have been a disaster. And my mom saw that. My mom saw that trying to get back together with this man would have been really unhealthy for her. And so they remained split up and living their separate lives. But his role was that of, like, he was a chiropractor, he was her doctor in the community, and my mother's role was that she worked on staff. She worked in the art department. She was one of the few people who actually got to exercise this unique skill set that she had specifically developed, and getting to use that on staff. She got to she illustrated some of the books and publications that the church was putting out at the time. And for her as well, she got access to mental health care. She wound up getting to go to therapy at that time, which she needed. It made a big difference for her. And so I would say the reasons for sticking around and staying in it were a little bit different. But I think my mom thought it was the best that she could do for us as kids at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you've had quite the journey between your two parents, and all the challenges they dealt with, and just everything surrounding it. We're going to switch gears a little bit here. How does a person find their own identity after leaving a cult or a religion?
I think to a certain degree, getting out of a cult or a religion is a little bit like detoxifying from an addiction, because it fundamentally changes who you think you are as a being. And if that indoctrination begins at a very young age, that's really difficult, because I believe, that from the Buddhist standpoint, we all have this, everybody, all of us, all humans, all living beings, we have this core of intrinsic goodness and innocence. And where a lot of cult mentalities support that in the notion that yes, you're good, they also take it a further step where not only are you good and intrinsically innocent, but you're special. And that kind of conditioning to a young mind is actually really incredibly toxic and can lead to what I would consider to be narcissistic dysfunction, and often a lack of functional empathy, because you're indoctrinated with this notion that you're special, and therefore anything that you do is sort of is above examination. And that's not healthy for kids. It's not healthy for anybody. So I think, and I've heard this, with different people who have come out of different religious systems, there's a detoxification process. There's sort of a recognition of what belief systems and what feelings within those belief systems kind of created your own habitual responses or adaptations, and having to examine those, just in the same way that if an addict really truly wants to heal from addiction, they can't just blame the system. They can't just blame the substance. You actually have to look at how you function within it and why, what you get out of it, how it's shaped how you think and feel about yourself and the world. And that's hard. That's hard work.
And how, like for you, how long has that detox process taken?
It comes in layers. I think in the same way that working through any trauma and sort of understanding more compassionately your adaptations to that trauma, the way that works, it unravels in layers. There's a group that's active for cut kids, and I was looking through some of the posts, and without even kind of realizing it, like what was going on, I became deeply triggered by what people were sharing, and it sort of woke this deeper sense in me very recently, like in the last few weeks. And I'm 40 years old, right? I was 9, 10 when all of this was happening with the shelter cycle. And then the years following, the years preceding. And we left staff when I was 16. But, I recently had this somatic memory of like being strapped to those bunk beds and how terrified and helpless that felt. And I think, as with any trauma, when you're really honest about the work, it can take years. It's not like all of a sudden like a switch shuts off and like you're not impacted. It's more like you build this deeper resilience within yourself, and you recognize, okay, I don't feel as destabilized by remembering or thinking about this today as I did yesterday or as I did 5 years ago. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, the same thing has happened for me. Like yeah, as I cut ties, I started to recognize that the way I dealt with my emotions and the way I dealt with other people and the view of myself was really shaped by that environment and my parents too. Um, but yeah, the process took years, and it's still a process. It's I think it's something that is a part of you for a very long time, just because if it affects the way you think and the way you feel about yourself and about other people, it it is a very gradual, um, very lengthy process, and it involves reflection or writing or meditation or if somebody's feeling anxious, do they feel anxious because of a belief, or do they feel anxious because they're remembering something from the past, and should they be dealing with it in the new person they are or the old person? When I knew that I didn't really agree with a lot of the beliefs and that they were harming me in different ways at a deep level, really deciding to pull away took like 4 or 5 years, and then really recognizing that I didn't believe 99% of it anymore took like 7 years. It took being around a lot of other people from other walks of life to really come to terms with the way I was told to view the world wasn't really the way the world was. And that conflict is something that I still deal with almost every day, whether it be around food or around sex or around the way I perceive other people, or even listening to music. Like if I accidentally flip onto a music station I don't like, sometimes I'll like instinctively just like flip it to another radio station right away because it makes me uncomfortable. And that might be like heavy metal. It might not be the Rolling Stones. Like I like the Rolling Stones. I like a bunch of music, but if I hear music that makes me uncomfortable, I immediately want it to stop. And if it doesn't stop, this anxiety just rises in me until I think we can tie that into the next thing, and that's what coping mechanisms do people have surrounding religious dogma and restrictions put upon them?
The one that comes immediately to the surface is cognitive dissonance. If you have been ingrained with a fundamental belief about something, whether it's rock music being evil or this particular food being toxic or being a you know what are some other ones that got shoved down our throat?
Pop culture was very demonized. Pretty much
Yes.
everything in pop culture, even politicians. I mean, we were told as kids that a lot of politicians were
Yes.
fallen angels or fallen ones or robots or the equivalent of lizard people. So,
Right.
how do we what coping and I think you're right. I think cognitive dissonance is a big coping mechanism, and I'm trying to dig into what some of the other ones might be. How does denial play into that?
I mean, I think the two go together, cognitive dissonance and denial. It's you get out into the world and you're in this bigger world and you're confronted with these conflicting ideas that have been so deeply ingrained in you. And at a level, like you're saying, with like shutting down, you hear this music that makes you uncomfortable, like that's what people do when they're confronted with a belief system that challenges who they feel like they are at a core level, at a fundamental level. They shut down and they become incapable of taking in new information. And that is the essence of denial right there. I think another one is going to be positivity bypassing, big time.
And what is that?
So I would define the positivity bypass in terms of if you have been conditioned to see the world through a certain lens, and say that lens is geared towards being positive, really only kind of taking in good vibrations, only focusing on good vibrations, only focusing on positive outcomes, only focusing your energy on what you want to see and what you want to have happen, then the tendency of the mind is to go into trance around experiences that do not fit through that filter. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous for as a whole, as a collective, but it's also dangerous for individuals because they will fail to see signals that would be indicative of danger either within relationships or within larger organizations. They simply cannot take in the information that they have been that they've been programmed to filter out, if that makes sense.
I think just about everybody who's grown up and out of any fringe religions has had to deal with that in one way or another. And sometimes it's only one topic, like food or sexuality, but sometimes it's almost everything in your life, depending on how strict of an environment somebody was placed into and what their family dynamic was like.
Well, and then there's the othering as well that comes into play. You know, one of the things that I remember really sticking with me and feeling so incredibly wrong was during an ethics discussion with one of the school administrators. We were being indoctrinated how we were light bearers and how when we went out into the world, we could expect other people to be drawn towards our light because they didn't have any of their own. Now, I'm sorry, but you're basically setting people up to victimize themselves in these situations because they're perceiving themselves as so special now that everybody wants what they have. And yet you're not teaching them empathy or how to navigate these relationships with effective boundaries. You're just telling them that this is what's going to happen to you. And you're forever going to be dealing with this. Like, way to set people up to be like, like gaslit. And like, I definitely, I believe in emotional vampirism. I see it. Like, I've experienced it. But in order to play those dynamics out, you have to play in them. You have to participate. You have to engage. So they're telling us what's going to happen without giving us any tools to navigate it. Like, that was extremely detrimental from my perspective.
Yeah, and the only tools, I totally agree with you. I think it's very difficult. And it puts the child in a position of, do they pray away anything that makes them uncomfortable? Like if somebody treats them in a way they don't like, do they pray it away? Do they defend themselves? Do they write off the other person as having dark energy or a bad aura, or not being able to separate the person's, separate out the person's attitudes, behaviors from who that person is at a deep level? Yeah, and you kind of give the children a complex. Like, I don't know if I want to coin the term lightbearer complex, but maybe it's something, it's kind of a chosen one complex where this mantle is put upon you and you're expected to uphold a certain standard. And if you don't, you either feel the shame of being less than what you should be and less than what God wants you to be, which is that's a pretty difficult burden to bear, especially as a child trying to just figure out their place in the world and navigate really who they are and what right and wrong is and a whole host of things.
Like, I want to talk about this because I think it's relevant. There's this guy, Morris Berman, who wrote this book, Coming to Our Senses. And in it, there's a chapter on ascension culture and the rise of Nazism. And he draws the comparison between Nazism being an ascension culture because they were so focused on being the highest and the best that it separated them from their more basic human instincts. And it created this big sort of gaping gap, within their humanity. And Church Universal and Triumphant, their entire focus was on ascension. So you're basically taking these little people who are just trying to walk around and learn how to be humans, and you are telling them that their entire focus for their life, without having any life skills, without having to learn about empathy or boundaries, or how to relate to each other more effectively, but their entire focus in life needs to be on ascending. It needs to be on being these light bearers. So when these more uncomfortable emotions show up, when anger, when depression, when anxiety, when any of that surfaces, it's, to a large degree, I feel like it was considered to be a demonic attack and something that you were supposed to be able to rise above by focusing on your more ascension-driven qualities. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Anger especially, but I would say anger, sadness, and fear, those were all things that you were really supposed to either pray away, or you're supposed to get them out of your life entirely because they're unnatural. Like, I was really taught that anger is a very unnatural and dark, evil, whatever adjective you want to use, response to things. And so I felt very, very guilty whenever I'd get upset as a kid. And then I'd feel shame about feeling those emotions that everybody feels. And I didn't know at the time that was really unhealthy to have that conflict.
So, I mean, speaking for myself and a group of other kids that I know, like, what do you tend to do when you have emotions, when you have these big feelings inside of you that, according to the doctrine that you've been raised in, are dark or not permissible? You look for ways to check out of them. You look for ways to numb out. And I know a lot of us that got kind of wrapped in the sort of addiction cycle. I was one of them. I'm not entirely like blaming that on the church and by any regards, like familial conditions, everything else. But we look for a way to soothe and ease ourselves when we feel like there is something wrong with us, whether that's physical discomfort or whether that's psychic or emotional discomfort. And I think to a large degree, some of these ideas that were shared through this organization also had an addictive quality because they divorced you and removed you from your very human experience. And they focused on this kind of sort of mental dissociation from the lower chakras, right? From the more physical, more primal experiences. I was reading through someone's post today about like rules around how many times a week people are supposed to or allowed to have sex, and rules around oral sex and what kind of sex you can have. Like, you start messing with people's primal instincts and they're going to develop some pretty weird coping strategies to deal with it,
I had heard stories about, and I don't know if these are just rumors, if they're true, but stories about people who are our parents' age that felt like they had to pray before they had sex because they didn't want to let the darkness in. They didn't want to do anything that would give access to any, do anything sexual that would violate their light bearer mantle.
And I mean, there's two layers of, I hear what you're saying, and like, I just feel like shock and like, it's so terrible to think about. But I also know that like indirectly I experienced the influence of that from how they programmed us around sex to how it was treated in the community. Like, I'm sensitive, I pick stuff up. And I think what you just said is unfortunate in two layers. And one, that you're creating like something toxic around a very natural human experience that is designed to create pleasure and connection. And two, you're creating this false sense of fragility around your spirituality that it could be destroyed by something as simple as engaging in human pleasure. And that's gaslighting on two levels, and that's really disturbing to me.
Tying into that, I remember being a teenager, and I don't know if my dad had mentioned it. It definitely wasn't my mom, but my dad was always the vocal one about like, you can't do this and you can't do that, and this is dark and this is astral. And at some point, oral sex came up, and it was about, like, if you have oral sex, you're not ascending, period. And I'm thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Like, it's something that has existed for thousands of years and isn't isn't um, isn't labeled as unhealthy by any modern psychologist, any modern therapist, nothing. Not any ones that are at least not religiously affiliated. Um, and that really stuck with me, and really it really disrupted a lot of my relationships in my early 20s all the way through, I would say, my late 20s. Yeah, my early to late 20s. Because it was just this core of fear that if I do something a little bit wrong, everything I've worked for in my life is gone in a snap. That all the goodness that I've done is for naught, basically.
Yeah, that's intense. That's what I mean by like by your spiritual core being so fragile. Like that's a really toxic way to program people, because it actually seems to me like it intentionally keeps them off balance. Like if your spirituality is that fragile where all your spiritual work can be destabilized by doing one thing, then you need me. You need this organization to keep you in place. You need these rules and regulations to keep you in check, because you clearly don't have clearly you can't do it on your own. And I think there's a certain mentality of people of emotional maturity and the level of resilience and sovereignty and confidence that they have all across the board to be drawn to organizations that use that kind of programming to keep a person in check, and that they are destabilized. They don't trust themselves. They don't have that sense of internal authority. They count on that external authority. They count on those rules. They count on those regulations. And that's the correlation that I see that goes through pretty much all cults and a lot of the fundamentalist religions in general, that you can't function without these rules and regulations. You don't know who you are. You don't know how to operate, and you will be spiritually lost without us.
Yeah, it puts people in a position where they feel stuck or unable to leave, even if they wanted to. Yeah. Yeah, so we're talking about some of these traumas and different things. How do people heal from PTSD experienced in childhood, especially surrounding spirituality?
I think spiritual abuse is one of the most insidious and hardest things to heal from, because the people who deliver it have been perceived to be more than human. So think about it this way. Like, if someone hits you, they hit you hard enough, you're going to have a bruise, right? And you're going to be able to watch that bruise fade over time. You're going to heal. Emotionally, are you going to trust that person? There's layers and nuance to that. Emotionally, same thing. Someone says something to you, it gets into you, but you can kind of see and you can kind of feel where it's coming from. And it takes longer to heal. Emotional abuse very often takes a lot longer to heal from than physical abuse. And it's very rare that they come as completely separate incidences. They're usually combined. But spiritual abuse is coming from someone who has themselves, who has either put themselves in a position of spiritual authority in your life, where they have claimed a position greater than a regular human relating experience. And so the information and the abuse that they deal down becomes a part of your psyche in such a way as whereas you relate to that information as being fundamental to who you are, not something that you experienced from another person, but these ideologies and that this treatment it gets into you in such a way where it reorganizes your selfhood. And you throw in something like you throw in physical abuse, you throw in emotional abuse, particularly like with situations like the Catholic Church. You throw in this level of abuse coming from these people, and like you've essentially just you've disrupted someone's core identity and the way that they interface with the world. And that's hard to heal from, because the more they identify with it, the less likely they are to question that part of themselves, or to question those teachings, to question those beliefs. And then like we already said, you run into denial, you run into cognitive dissonance, you run into all the addictions and coping mechanisms that people employ in order to have to avoid that pain. It's insidious.
I think it was Sean, he had brought up this idea of a disconforming event. And that happens when something is disruptive to the belief system, like the nuclear war didn't happen. They supposedly prayed it away. But a lot of people left after that disconforming event. But some people clung to the beliefs even tighter because it was probably too painful to face the reality that it wasn't real, that either it was made up or it was something just told to them to get them to act a certain way, and to fall in line. How do you feel liberated after leaving that environment and being away from it now for a couple of decades?
So when I first left the environment, I was 16. I moved to Bozeman. I went to regular high school for the first time, and I realized I could skip school because there was more than 4 of us in a class. I realized that, all I needed to do to be able to do what I wanted to do was get home in time to get that call from the school. And I could basically do what I wanted to do all day. And my mom was busy at college, and I really took it to the far other side of the spectrum. But that's kind of how I'm wired. And it was great. I definitely noticed, like, an absence of the regimented structure that I had grown up with so much of, coming from the community and the isolation, that, given these opportunities and the presented with this possible freedom, like, I jumped wholly into it. And I have a very exploratory nature, so I explored as much as I wanted to, until that kind of ran its course. And I would say, in spite of kind of a, it's interesting for me because, as a healer and hypnotherapist, what I do, people consider me to be, kind of fringy and sort of new agey. And to a degree I am, but I work with people's consciousness. I've studied, I've studied the mind. I've studied relationships, boundaries. I've done a lot of work to give sort of more of a cognitive structure to the work that I do than besides just the woo-woo healing work. But I'm in this really interesting fringe position where I'm highly cynical. I'm highly dubious about a lot of sort of new age spiritualism. I find the toxic the positivity culture to be absolutely toxic. I find the law of attraction to largely be based around gaslighting, and where there are some ideas that can work for some people there, like what you focus your energy onto, like, can you manifest more of that in your life? Yes, but those rules don't apply for people in the same way if they have trauma. Like, it's complicated. It's complicated. I would say, I have a deep, unshakable spiritual core, but I would consider that core to be more Gnostic. I consider life itself to be spiritual. I don't consider there to be a hierarchy between, the physical realm and the spiritual realm. I consider every single thing that I do to be sacred. And, from that way, like, I live my life in a very intentional way, but it's also very grounded. And what I found and what I remember from the church is, like, there was those grounded practices. There was farming, there was this and there was that, but there was also a lot of compartmentalization. And I work actively in myself and with my clients to break down those compartments, to be like, okay, this is no less human or no less spiritual than this. It's just a matter of, like, do you want to play in it? Do you want to engage in it? But I feel a lot of frustration when I run into that dogma, when I run into these, I think the cult mentality, the sort of the blind willingness to kind of follow into some of these conspiracy theories. And I'm a little reluctant to use that term because I think it becomes demonized, and not all alternative theories to the mainstream narrative are just total pseudoscience nonsense. Like, it's worth it to investigate stuff, but there is a particular culture and mentality that seems to be attracted to, say, like the QAnon people, that are also attracted to the New Age spiritualism. There's certain correlation between people who are Trump followers and people who do the QAnon, and people who are attracted to New Age spiritualism. And I find it fascinating and frustrating and terrifying. I feel like that was a really convoluted answer, but there you go.
I'm glad you mentioned the QAnon thing. And, even though people talk about conspiracy theories, it's really hard to not label it as that, because we don't know always the origin of them, like how people come up with some of this stuff, if they're just getting it from Alex Jones, or if they're getting it from somebody on Reddit or 4chan, where, especially something like QAnon, it basically came out of nowhere, and it's now grown into this kind of scary movement in a large way. And
it feels very cult-like, doesn't it?
Yeah. It very much, not a lot of evidence, not really no hard evidence for all these things that they're claiming, using actually tactics very similar to CUT to demonize the quote unquote enemy. So that enemy could be the Democrats, it could be Joe Biden, it could be anyone who doesn't want to see Trump reelected or thinks that Trump is a douchebag.
Or a malignant narcissist even. Like, yeah.
As we're recording this, the 2020 election is less than a month away, and there's a lot of things up in the air with it. Are all the votes going to get counted? And will a lot of people's votes be disputed, even though they're legitimate? And growing up in CUT, there was a very strong political ideology surrounding the destiny of America, and opposition to anything perceived as communism. Anything perceived as too progressive was just flat out gaslighted or labeled as being like demonic or evil.
Fallen angels' agendas, right?
Yeah, fallen angels' agendas, if it's anything progressive. And that could be anything to do with women's healthcare choices. That could be anything to do with even education in America. Some of the offshoot groups of Church Universal and Triumphant think that they pray against Common Core because they think it's evil in some way, or they think it's manipulating children.
I think it's confusing, but yeah.
Sure. I've seen some of the Common Core stuff, and some of it is definitely confusing, but I don't think it's manipulating children.
That's hilarious. I had not even heard that. That's wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that may be more some of the offshoot groups of Church Universal and Triumphant that are latching onto that being something bad. But now, as we approach the election, there's really some interesting parallels between the followership of CUT and Trumpism, and this movement in America towards things that are not rational, that are not fact-driven, that are not science-driven. And so the question I have is, why do you think many of the faithful in CUT have an adoration and some even an extreme loyalty to Trump.
I wish I could think of the exact title. I wrote an article on this on Elephant Journal, and it's something along like what's the connection between Trump and cult mentality? It's trauma, and I believe that wholeheartedly, that the connection between cult mentality and Trumpism is trauma. And I think it's very common for people who have experienced trauma, who have been gaslit in their lives, who have perhaps come from these other religious organizations that I found a lot of people who were drawn to cut have also been, either spiritual seekers or had kind of removed themselves from some other kind of mainstream or fundamentalist religion. So there's already a core there that's active. And in the same way that some of the core tenets that were taught and practiced by Church Universal and Triumphant say, like, that it's okay to demonize people that you don't like. It's okay to other people. Xenophobia is okay. Making decisions for other people about their bodies and what they do based on your moral preferences is okay. These are all things that Trump also stands for. So it is a direct correlation between the way that Trump has gaslit, abused, and manipulated the United States into this position in which we're basically in this massive abusive relationship with a malignant narcissist. A lot of the core tenets and principles under which Church Universal and Triumphant functioned are also the same tenets and principles that function within an unhealthy narcissistic relationship. That you don't actually know what you're thinking or feeling. I know better, and I know what's right for you. That you don't actually have autonomy over your body and your decisions about it because, once again, I know what's right for you. That you aren't mature enough to make up your own mind, and that your feelings around what is happening are not right because I have the right to decide what feelings are appropriate for you or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about, was Elizabeth Clare Prophet a narcissist, and some of her kids have weighed in on, what mental health issues might have been going on besides what her epilepsy caused, because epilepsy can cause hallucinations. So some people have explained away the dictations and her other, spiritual inspirations as being a result of the epilepsy. But when you have somebody in a position of power like that, if they really believe in it, how are they? This is something I've had a hard time coming to terms with. If they're in that position of power and they genuinely believe that what they're doing is real, how are they even existing in reality if they think they have this connection to another world or to beings on other planets or, dozens of beings floating around in the ether that are above all humanity?
Who all happen to be suspiciously Aryan in the construction of their appearance.
Yeah, I was noticing.
Throw that out there.
I didn't notice that until after I left the church, that there was one, well, you could call it a token black master. There was one token Chinese master.
Right.
All the rest of them were white. There's even the representation of Jesus in their altars is still white, which doesn't make sense. It kind of aligns with the evangelical portrayals of Jesus that paint him as being white and not dark skinned and Middle Eastern.
even like the etheric organization was called the Great White Brotherhood. Like, I'm sorry, do you get any more xenophobic than that? Like, seriously. um Not to get too sidetracked, but it's not actually a sidetrack. It fits right in with what we're talking about. Because here we have this figurehead in the White House who that's what he is. He's a figurehead. He's a figurehead for Nazism, for xenophobia, for white supremacy, and for malignant narcissism. That's what he is. I don't think it's even right to call him a leader. But he has become a figurehead for these more toxic and dangerous groups, and that is terrifying. And I think, I think the correlation between them is really easy to draw. I think it's really easy to see. I think, and in the same way, you have to understand this. This is another thing, like, particularly if you're putting someone, like, it's one thing to have like a malignant narcissist in your home. However, it's also really important to like a parent, right? Like a father figure or whatever. But it's also really important for us to acknowledge that these conditions, these people, and the way that they step into these conditions, they are a co-arising dynamic. So in the same way that Elizabeth Clare Prophet may have had narcissistic tendencies, those would have been inflated by people investing so much power and authority over like some of the most minute details of their lives, like who could they date and what to name their children, you know?
Sure. Yeah. My parents did that too. They didn't name me. They were going to name me Christopher, and they hadn't named me as a baby yet. And then they wrote into her and said, "Hey, do you have any ideas?" More or less. I don't know what the exact words were, but they wanted her input. And then she gave me the name Baird, and she named, as far as I know, dozens of other children. Yeah, which is such a weird thing for somebody else to name your child if it's not somebody related to you.
Or telling you who you can or can't date, yeah, I mean, things like that. But I think it's important to recognize, particularly with an authoritarian malignant narcissism, it arises from a group dynamic. Trump, before he got elected, he's always been a narcissist, yes, but you put a narcissist like that in a position of power where he is reflecting all of these toxic ideas that have already been held within the collective, and not only like approving of them, like giving them his stamp of approval, right? Like, of course that's going to grow. Those dynamics are going to grow within the collective, and his self-inflation is going to grow as well. So it's important to remember when dealing with that, whether it's, within a church system, or whether it's in a political system, or even in a family system. It's a co-arising dynamic. They have to be, their narcissism has to be supported by the environment, or it can't grow to become as bloated and out of proportion as it has. And I think the same thing could be said with Elizabeth Clare Prophet. When she first took over the mantle, my perception of is that she seemed a bit more human. And as time went on and both her epilepsy progressed and her sort of identification with this role of being Guru Ma also progressed, she seemed to become less human. And Trump has certainly become less human. He was sort of just a nasty, sort of bloated misogynist when he got elected. And now, what is he? He is the figurehead for all that is gross and inhumane and xenophobic in this country. And that's terrifying to me.
Yeah, and the other hard thing is that because he's enabled by so many people, he's not only enabled by these people, but it's this weird dynamic where they'll justify, if they agree with him on one issue, say pro-life, pro-life stance on abortion, they'll somehow rationalize away all the other horrible things, all the other harmful ways he acts and behaves, and and chooses to put laws in the country that hurt people. So I don't really understand how they do that if there's an expression for it.
It's dissociation. So, and it's from a trauma bond. So when people are raised around an abusive person, particularly a caregiver, they have to continue to bond to that person, and people will reject themselves instead of rejecting their caregiver. If a person is abusive to a child, that child will not reject that parent. They will reject themselves. These people, in order to maintain what they perceive to be this moral high ground within this one position, are capable of rejecting everything else within themselves that doesn't match that in order to maintain this trauma bond to Trump.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I really didn't understand it before, and the further this has went on over a 4-year period and how it's exacerbated and gotten worse, it just doesn't make sense to me how more people haven't woken up and said, this is really, really wrong. Why am I adoring this person? Why am I leaning on his every word? Why am I blindly following him when there's so much harm that's being done, especially since the pandemic started, and the failed response to that? We're going to take a short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. So we're coming back from a short break, and we were talking about the correlation between Trumpism and what's going on in our political climate right now, and kind of cult mentalities and how those develop and are co-created. So you had an article in Elephant Journal. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I wrote this piece. It's called Unraveling the Link Between Trump Trauma and Cult Mentality. I'll just read you a quote out of it, because I think it kind of sums up nicely what we were saying about why people are so able to edit out information that doesn't actually fit with their core beliefs because they believe so strongly this other thing, and it ties in with the cognitive dissonance and the denial and everything else we were talking about. So here's, and the positivity bypass. So the reliance on the need to only take in what is perceived as positive or permissible in the eyes of their God causes them to also edit out uncomfortable feelings and adhere to undeveloped beliefs and sometimes conspiracy theories that allow them to perpetuate a state of emotional and cultural ignorance. If their version of God, their leader, or the news sources who spin these savior narratives say it's true, it must be. Critical thinking is highly discouraged by these factions, but must be exercised to confront narcissism.
Yeah, that explains so much of what's going on in the world today and why people are acting the way they are. Especially in these really trying times leading up to the 2020 election.
Well, and one of the things that I consider to be a problem from the people who are actually trying to confront him is the name calling. We need to learn to have compassionate discussion with each other, regardless of our belief systems, that actually confronts the ideology rather than dehumanizes the other, because that's just leads to more of the same. That leads to more divisiveness. And at this point, both sides are responsible for perpetuating it. And, compassion doesn't necessarily, it certainly doesn't mean that we turn our cheek and that we close our eyes and that we just say that it's all good. It means that we have boundaries, but that within those boundaries, we require a standard of treating each other as human beings. Even if the other is dehumanizing others, we can't stoop to that level. And the only way to actually change the dynamics within these systems is to confront behaviors, confront the ideologies, to come at these sort of insane ideas with facts and actual, real grounded compassion. Yeah, I want to see everybody stop being part of the problem.
Yeah, because come mid-November or whenever we actually know who the winner is, whenever the dust settles, there's still going to be tension. That tension's not going to go away overnight, unfortunately. It's going to take a long time to be resolved. No matter who wins, a third of America or 40% of America is probably going to be pretty angry, and maybe even distraught, depending on who wins.
Well, and it's like we were talking about too with like the trauma bonding, like recognizing people, the reason that they're doing these things is they believe that the person that they are choosing is not only going to be able to address these social conditions, but whether they're conscious of it or not, they also believe that this person is going to be able to meet these deep unmet needs in themselves. And that is the nature of the trauma bond, is to put these very human, unrequited needs on people who are incapable of meeting them. And I think regardless of who winds up in this position, that's going to be a continuing factor. We all, as human beings, have these deep emotional, psychological, human needs that are not being met, that are actually being more systematically destroyed and devalued than they are being met by our social or our political system. And that's not going to change no matter who wins the election. So it's a really good time to kind of get curious about your belief systems, about what motivates you, what do you truly value, and how can you live that? How can you embody that? How can you enact that in the world? Because the need for that, no matter who wins, that's not going to change. And I think underlying any kind of religiosity or any kind of politicism is, this attempt to meet these deeper human needs. And we can all do a better job being responsible for those. We don't need God savior mentality to take care of that for each other, for ourselves. We need to take care of that for ourselves and with each other.
Yeah, I hear you. Especially the way the world is right now with the pandemic. That's even harder to get our basic needs met emotionally, psychologically, physically, all of it.
I like to always kind of come back to like just being gentle with ourselves and remembering to breathe and take care of our basic human needs. Like, something that we want to do if we can at any cost. Like anytime like you have to deal with an important conversation or you're faced with an important decision or even you're feeling emotionally triggered, like check in with yourself, like take a breath, make sure you're hydrated. Eat something. Like if you need to speak to someone that you find reassuring. Like these are basic self-care steps that have nothing to do with our political affiliation, nothing to do with how we perceive ourselves to be religious beings. These are just basic human needs that we all need to get better at meeting. And I think that makes us better humans, really. So whatever you believe religiously, whatever you believe politically, like for now, like, can we just all focus on being more decent humans? Like, let that be the unifying thread.
Yeah, I hear you. It's easy to just mudsling at people and say, well, you're the problem. If we come together and recognize that we're all human beings and we all have feelings and unmet needs, there can be a lot more of a deeper healing that will really address the problems in our country and in the world. It was so wonderful sharing this conversation with you because I think you've done a lot of deep work. Everything I've learned about you since I met you, just knowing the deep work you've done with other people within yourself and being able to speak to a lot of the vocabulary surrounding the psychology of what's going on, what we dealt with as kids, and the healing that we still go through, I think is very relevant to what's going on right now. So I thank you so much for your time, Justice, and we're definitely going to talk again because I think there's so many more topics that you can speak to from experience and wisdom.
Thank you. And if people want to find me and learn more about my work, they can find me at illuminationwithjustice.com. Thank you for your time, and thanks for inviting me into this conversation. And I look forward to delving into more of this rich material with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to it, Justice. Thanks to our audience. You've been listening to Blinded by the Light, a podcast exploring the stories of people who grew up in Church Universal and Triumphant. If you enjoyed this podcast, the best thing you can do to support us is telling your friends and family. Building a community around these topics matters, because having our voices heard can mean greater healing and insights into our collective experiences. Subscribe to Blinded by the Light in your favorite podcasting app, or subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest episodes. If you'd like to be on the show or want to send us stories for consideration, email the show at blindedpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.